University, Renmin University. I'm so honored to moderate tonight's lecture made by Professor Charles Armstrong. He came from Columbia University's Weatherhead Institute for East Asia Studies. The Weatherhead EAI, East Asia Institute. The title, the lecture, this is a series lecture, sponsored, co-sponsored by Columbia University Beijing Center, Global Center, one of the global centers in East Asia, in Beijing, and our school, School of International Studies at Renmin University. And we are so glad to have Professor Armstrong. And the lecture, the three lectures, in my view, mainly about China's relations with China's neighbors, immediate neighbors. And one neighbor is Korea Peninsula, and on some people call it two Koreas, and on some people call it one Korea. And the other neighbor is Mongolia, and the third neighbor is Central Asia. And we will have three lectures on these three Chinese immediate neighbors on regions, and Central Asia is a region. So, and I remember, and one of my colleagues in Beijing who conducts international studies, particularly American affairs, Professor Wang Jisi at Beijing University, and this year he published an article at New York-based Foreign Affairs, and he said that China is not only an East Asia country, China is also maybe Central Asia country and Southeast Asia country, and because China borders with all Asian countries, with Central Asia, South Asia, Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia. So this is a very special location, the Chinese location in the region and in the world. So, and in my view, and these three lectures organized, organized by Columbia Global Center in Beijing, very useful, very valuable, very meaningful, thoughtful, and to deal with this key question. For me, I fully support to have these three lectures by three distinguished scholars from the Columbia University. And tonight, I'm honored to have moderated the first lecture, titled China and North Korea, and anatomy of a relationship. And maybe many people interested in such a topic, China and the DPRK and North Korea. And because we have long diplomatic relations to recognize the DPRK and in China, and generally, and in public events, we continue to call North Korea as DPRK, formally, diplomatically, politically. So, and I will respond to your question, to your lecture later. And let me finish my brief introduction to the lecture. And Professor Armstrong's CV, personal history, academic history, you can find at this brochure. It's one page and a very excellent personal history. He's a historian, and he's a leading scholar, leading specialist in modern history of Korea and East Asia. He can speak several East Asian languages, of course, and the Korean language, Chinese language, and maybe Japanese? Yeah, a little bit of Japanese. So, and I'm sorry. Professor. And the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me get back to the PowerPoint. Is this working? Okay, good. Thank you very much, Professor Pan. It's wonderful to be here at People's University in Beijing. Professor Pan exaggerates slightly, but I used to be able to speak Chinese many years ago, but I've forgotten most of it, even when I get in a taxi. I spent a year as a student in the northeast of China, in Changchun. And at that time, it was a great treat to come down to Beijing, the big city, where there was so many exciting things happening. So it's wonderful to be invited here and to spend a little bit of time in Beijing. As Dr. Pang says, I am a...
Sorry, and I have to interrupt you. And on this panel, and we have Professor Han from Seoul, and he's a visiting professor at the Peking University, and also my university. I graduated from Beijing University, and Professor Han accompanied Professor Armstrong to this lecture, and personally and institutionally, we welcome you to join the lecture. And maybe you give some comments firstly to the lecture, and because you came from Korea. Thank you very much for your coming.
It's rather intimidating to be next to Professor Han, who is a very renowned, perhaps the leading sociologist of South Korea in recent years. I am primarily a historian of Korea, and in particular, in the last 10 years or so, I've been doing a lot of work on North Korea. To underscore what Professor Pang has said, actually China borders 20 countries. China borders more countries than any country in the world. The United States, in contrast, only has 2 neighbors, Canada to the north, Mexico to the south. China has 20. But I think it's fair to say that the North Korean neighbor is one of the most, if not the most, difficult for China to deal with. And this has been the case all along. Despite an officially very good relationship, there have been many ups and downs of the China-DPRK relationship, which is what I will talk about. I'll give a historical overview of this relationship over the whole period from the time the 2 states were founded, and I'll touch a little bit on the contemporary problems. I just visited North Korea in June of this year, and I can talk a little bit about my impressions of that visit. And I will actually show a couple of photos from that visit as well. So forgive me if this is a somewhat superficial sketch, but I wanted to get a sense across of the overall history of this, I think, very complicated and dynamic relationship, more complicated than many, at least outside of China, realized, and then conclude with a few thoughts of where I think this relationship, which is very critical, not for just China and North Korea, but for the rest of the world, and not least for the United States, which has a great stake in this region and in what happens in North Korea and between China and North Korea as well. Now, when I talk about an anatomy of a relationship, anatomy means the body, and it's often a metaphor for a kind of examination of a relationship. But I also mean that in a sense literally, because perhaps the most common expression that we see from the Chinese side in describing the relationship is lips and teeth, as close as lips and teeth. And we see that a lot, even in the US media, but few people have dug down the background of this to see what this means. This phrase, lips and teeth, actually comes from the spring and autumn annals in ancient China. And has to do with a story of, whoops, wait a minute, we're not, what happened to the projection?
Hmm. Hmm. Okay. This is what happens when you become too dependent on technology.
Technology bring calmness. When a problem happens, it becomes like a disaster.
That's strange. It was working a minute ago. Let me go back then, and hopefully we will get the images. So just try to imagine the images in your mind.
What is the music? We are so sorry.
This expression, lips and teeth, is a reference to a kind of security dilemma. That is to say, that two parties need each other. And although it is a very physical, a very intimate metaphor, it actually is a very practical one. The expression is when the teeth are, when the lips are gone, the teeth are cold, so that the lips protect the teeth. And I think that's actually a very interesting and very appropriate expression for the way that China has viewed its relationship, not just with North Korea, but for Korea in general. Now, the China-North Korean relationship, of course, goes much farther back. It is part of a much longer history of relations between China and the Korean Peninsula, which have been neighboring civilizations for thousands of years. But in particular, the kind of classic pattern of relations which we understand to this day of Korean-Chinese relations was established in the Ming period of China, and the Joseon period of Korea. And that is China as a kind of elder brother, a protective figure to Korea. And for China, Korea as a buffer state, protector of China against external enemies. And this was in particular encapsulated, exemplified in the Japanese invasions of the 1590s, in which Korea became a battleground between Japan and the Ming. Japan was eventually defeated, and Japanese forces went back to the islands. But the Koreans were saved, their country was saved by Ming protection, and from that point onward, there was a great deal of respect for the Ming on the part of Korea. And this attitude toward China was expressed in a two-character phrase, sadek or shida, to serve the great. We'll talk a bit later about how that plays out in modern times. However, after the Ming Dynasty fell to the Qing in 1644, the Qing were, as most of you probably know, a Manchu people, not a Han Chinese from the northeast. The Koreans tended to see China, to see the Qing as somewhat less than civilized. They never had the kind of reverence for the Qing as they had done for the Ming. And Korea began to distance itself in this time from China and to cultivate a kind of separate identity as what the Koreans call the small China, 说中话, 小中话. And this mentality also, I think, is very important in the way it's continued onto the modern world. So we have really two different views of this relationship. From the Chinese side, there's a kind of Middle Kingdom mentality of China as a superior country. China as the force that protects Korea, but also Korea should show respect to China. Korea, on the other hand, has tended to see this relationship more in equal terms. That there are two sovereign nations, and that Korea has a great deal of autonomy, of freedom. And that difference characterizes China-Korean relations, and especially, I think, China-North Korean relations throughout the 20th century and into today. Okay. Well, I don't think I'm going to need the internet. Right. The modern history of China and North Korea begins even before the two states were founded. Aha. So you don't have to read this whole story about the Duke of Xian and the state of Jin and so forth, but just the part at the bottom explains what this phrase means. Two persons or things share a common fate, and if one common lot, and if one fails, the other is in danger. Again, not really a intimate or friendly expression so much as we may just. Can you hear me without the microphone?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Let me shout over. Just turn that off. Which is better than the feedback. Feedback works for Jimi Hendrix, but in an academic lecture, that's not necessarily a good thing. A very kind of real politics, security relationship is what this phrase actually involves. So this is what I had said about the classic period of China-Korean relations in the Ming and Joseon, and the way in which Korea and China really saw this relationship rather differently. This picture is the person is standing up in the back in the middle is Kim Il-sung for the 1930s. China and Korea, China and North Korea began their relationship in the modern sense really before the two states were founded, when they were both in a kind of revolutionary. Is this going to work? Should I stand back? I understand that People's University is the leading university in China for social sciences, but perhaps not for technology. A period in which these sort of revolutionary forces were motivated by anti-Japanese nationalism, both in Korea, which was taken over by Japan in 1910, and by China, which was attacked by Japan in the 1930s. And especially in Manchuria, the northeast of China, the ethnic Koreans, which were a very large community in China at that time, and the Chinese communists united together. And indeed, after the late 1920s, the ethnic Korean communists in China joined the Chinese Communist Party, and one of the young guerrilla fighters in the northeast of China was a Korean named Kim Sung-ju, who took the name Kim Il-sung, who joined the Chinese Communist Party, according to the records that we're familiar with in the West, in 1935, although in North Korea nowadays it is never mentioned that he joined the Chinese Communist Party, and was part of a kind of multi-ethnic anti-Japanese force called the Northeast Anti-Japanese League, or the Northeast Anti-Japanese United Army. From this experience, we see the formation of the two states, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and the People's Republic of China in the late 1940s. The Japanese surrender, the Soviet Red Army came through and took possession of the areas vacated by the Japanese forces, that is Manchuria and the northern part of Korea. The southern part was, of course, occupied by the United States. There were a very large number of ethnic Koreans in China who participated in the Chinese Civil War and did a great deal to make it possible for the Chinese to succeed in the war in the Northeast region. There were also Korean exiles from China that joined the North Korean government and military in the late 1940s, including Kim Il-sung, who we've seen, who was the first founding leader of North Korea. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea was founded in, actually September, sorry, that's a mistake. The Republic of Korea was founded in August, but the DPRK was founded in September of 1948, 3 weeks later, and the People's Republic of China, of course, in October of 1949. But 1 million ethnic Koreans remained in China afterward, and their descendants are still in the northeast, primarily in Jilin province in the Yangon region. Now, the Korean War was the critical event that brought the PRC and the DPRK together, and lent itself to another very common phrase, especially on the Korean side, which they talk about, which is a blood-cemented friendship, or friendship cemented in blood, meaning the experience of the war. Hundreds of thousands, over 1 million Chinese participated. At its peak, there were 1.3 million so-called Chinese People's Volunteers, or Chinese soldiers in Korea, defending the North against the United States and the United Nations and South Korean forces. They were under the overall command of Chinese General Peng De-Huai. And this became a very catalytic moment for the formation of the People's Republic of China, which had been founded less than a year before the war broke out in June of 1950. And in China, as many of you know, the war was called the Resist America, Aid Korea War. And it is seen to this day, I think, in China as a great victory, as the point in time in which China confronted the world's most powerful country, the United States, and fought it to a standstill. That friendship, that relationship is still celebrated in North Korea as well, as you can see by the postage stamp on the right. And there are monuments in both countries. The one on the bottom left is in Dandong, across the Yellow River from North Korea, and on the right, the Friendship Tower in Pyongyang, which celebrates the Chinese People's Volunteers. Although there are not that many people still alive who are veterans of the war on either side, that is still a very powerful historical memory that shapes the relationship between the two. And I think that should not be underestimated, even though there's a new generation in both North Korea and China today. That shared sacrifice is very important for linking the two countries together historically. And it's also important to keep in mind that it was the Chinese who did this, not the Soviets, not other countries, so that the North Korean relationship with the Chinese has been very special compared to their relationship with the Russians. Post-war reconstruction, here's a picture of what Pyongyang looked like immediately after the war. It was leveled. There were allegedly only 2 buildings left standing after the American bombing. The North Koreans claimed that the United States dropped 400,000 bombs on Pyongyang, which is roughly 1 bomb for every citizen of the city. Be that as it may, Pyongyang and indeed every other city of North Korea was basically destroyed. And in the tremendous task of post-war reconstruction as well, China played a very important role. 300,000 Chinese People's Volunteers soldiers remained in North Korea until they left in October of 1958. There was massive reconstruction assistance from the Soviet Union and China mostly, and by some estimates, China actually gave more to North Korea than the Soviet Union, although the Soviets claimed that they gave more. Be that as it may, since China itself was still a very poor country, just recovering from its own civil war, that kind of sacrifice, even after the war, of giving aid to North Korea was really quite remarkable, as well as Eastern Europe, Mongolia, and North Vietnam after 1954 also assisted North Korea in a huge multilateral, as it were, development project. China and North Korea at that time were on very similar paths, parallel paths of rapid industrialization in the late 1950s, early 1960s, which in China took the form of the Great Leap Forward, and in North Korea, the Chollima campaign. I put the Chinese characters up there so those of you who read Chinese know what that means. The Chollima was a legendary winged horse, like the Pegasus in Western myth, that could go 1,000 li, 1,000 miles in a single day. So it expresses this desire to modernize, to industrialize very rapidly. And in the late 1950s, in fact, North Korea was very successful at industrialization. At the same time, after this period of multilateral reconstruction, the Chinese and the Soviets began to quarrel. A conflict emerged between the two, and North Korea had to maneuver between them. And it was at this time that North Korea took upon itself the slogan of juche, or self-reliance, self-identity, self-sufficiency, which became its slogan for decades afterwards. And this was set up deliberately, I think, in contrast to the earlier term sade, or shida, which expressed the old Korean reverence and respect for China. Juche was the opposite, independence. And it was set up often in a way that articulated that juxtaposition. Sade was bad, juche was good. Sade jui, shida jui was translated in North Korean text as flunkyism or toadyism, giving in to the great power. Juche was the opposite, announcing North Korea's independence. The difference between China and North Korea, however, is that Korea maintained these types of slogans and patterns to this day. On the left is the Juche Tower in Pyongyang, which is the tallest tower in the country, and on the right the statue of the Cholima, which you can still see there as well. The winged horse with actually someone holding a book and a torch on top. For 30 years, in the period of the Cold War, North Korea played a very shrewd game, sometimes a very risky one, but in the end, one that more or less worked, of maneuvering between China and the United States. And basically the way North Korea did it was to threaten each that it would defect to the other side. So we would play off the competition between China and the Soviet Union to make demands on assistance from one or the other, because neither China or the Soviet Union wanted to lose North Korea. I think North Korea is probably the most successful country in the world of manipulating great powers from a very weak base, and I believe we can still see that in the way it deals with China in particular, but also even with the United States to this day. It had a more active relationship with China, many more exchanges, much more frequent visits of leaders, but the Soviet Union was, of course, a much richer country, and more economic and military aid came from Moscow. On the China-Korean relationship, there was an emphasis on a shared revolutionary experience and worldview, a blood-cemented friendship and personal ties in the first revolutionary generation, since Kim Il-sung himself had lived, indeed, much of his formative years in China and knew Chinese leaders personally, although he did not meet Mao before the end of the Second World War. And both of them were united in their opposition to the United States, and especially with the U.S. military presence in South Korea and the division of Korea. But as time went by, the two, that is China and Korea, became increasingly complex in their attitudes toward the United States, towards capitalist countries, and toward the Third World, which I'll get to in a moment. The low point of the relationship came in the late 1960s during the Cultural Revolution, when in fact China didn't have any friends in the world, with the possible exception of Albania. And even North Korea, with which it had a very close relationship before, China became quite critical. There were apparently even some small-scale skirmishes or military clashes on the border between China and North Korea. And North Korea began to very actively lean toward the Soviet Union and become much closer to the Soviet position. And then in the end of the 1960s, North Korea did some quite radical things, what we might call adventurism in Chinese parlance, particularly in January 1968, in which North Korean commandos attempted to assassinate the South Korean president, and also North Koreans captured the USS Pueblo, which was an American espionage ship, and kept its crew prisoners for 11 months. By the way, the Pueblo still is in North Korea. I visited it this summer. It is a museum of American aggression and imperialism, and a very interesting place to visit if you ever get a chance. It's docked right next to the landing site of another ship, the SS General Sherman, which ran aground in 1866, attempting to open up Korea to trade with the United States, to show the continuity, as the North Koreans see it, of American imperialism. And I will also return to that subject. In the early 1970s, things became rather complicated. The common front against the United States was difficult to sustain because China and the U.S. began to have a rapprochement, began to drop their hostile relationships with each other. And this was a shock to both North and South Korea. South Korea had been very much dependent on the US security guarantees, North Korea for Chinese, and the two came together for the first time to declare a joint communique of working toward unification on July 4th of 1972. North Korea on its own reached out to capitalist countries, especially Japan and Western Europe, for other kinds of economic relations beyond the socialist bloc, and had some limited or indirect contact with the United States through China. There was an idea floated within the US government of cross-recognition, that is to say, simultaneously, at the same time the US and Japan would normalize relations with Pyongyang, and China and the Soviet Union would recognize Seoul, but this was never implemented, and it still has not happened, or rather half of it has happened. China and Russia have relations with South Korea, but the US and Japan still have not normalized relations with the North. And why that is a question of international relations, perhaps Professor Pan can answer. In the mid-1970s, North Korean leader Kim Il-sung seemed to be convinced that history was on his side and Korea would soon be unified under his rule. He made a very radical speech in Beijing in April of 1975, saying if war breaks out on the Korean Peninsula, we will only lose the military demarcation line, the DMZ, dividing Korea, and we will gain the country's unification. But China and Korea were in fact taking different paths. And at the end of Kim Il-sung's stay in Beijing, he was much more toned down because apparently the Chinese leaders told him that he should not use such rhetoric. At least that's what we think happened. We don't know for sure. Chinese leadership was quite concerned that, in fact, North Korea would become too militant toward the South. There were many complicated things going on in several levels. In the socialist world, there was a conflict between Vietnam and Laos and Indochina, and then a war at the end of the 1970s between China and Vietnam. In terms of economic reform, China began very much to turn outward toward the capitalist world. North Korea abandoned most of its experiments with doing that and turned inward. And both North Korea and China became very active in the third world, especially in Africa. I won't be able to go into detail about that here, but in very different ways. In fact, and sometimes finding themselves on opposite sides of civil conflicts in sub-Saharan Africa. But both of them trying to give economic assistance to African countries, and for a while North Korea even presenting itself as a kind of model for economic development in the third world. In the 1980s, the divergence between North Korea and China became very sharp and very acute, especially in the areas that were of most importance to North Korea. For China, the Soviet Union was what they call a social imperialist. In fact, it was a greater enemy than the United States from the Chinese point of view. Whereas for North Korea, the Soviet Union was a very important strategic and fraternal ally. For China, the United States was more or less an ally, or at least a country with which it was aligned against the Soviet Union, if not allied. Whereas for North Korea, the United States was still the chief enemy. And for China, South Korea in the 1980s, as China embarked on a wide-ranging modernization reform, became almost a kind of economic model for China itself, as well as an increasingly important economic partner, whereas from the North Korean point of view, South Korea was still a puppet state, a client of the United States, without any legitimacy. The end of the Cold War became a very problematic period, especially for North Korea. We don't need to go into detail of all the events that happened. New reformist leadership in the Soviet Union unwittingly set into motion the events that would destroy the Soviet Empire and the Soviet Union itself. China and the Soviet Union had their own rapprochement, with Gorbachev visiting Beijing in 1989, which from a certain point of view was good for North Korea, but from another point of view reduced North Korea's ability to play them off against each other. The collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, Mongolia, and the Soviet Union was both a political and an economic shock to China, to North Korea, although not an economic shock, but still a political shock to China. But most disturbing of all for North Korea, its two main allies normalized relations with South Korea, the Soviet Union in 1990, China in 1992, and mainly because China would no longer block it, North Korea agreed to join the United Nations with South Korea in September of 1992. And this was followed shortly thereafter by the worst economic catastrophe in North Korea since the Korean War, the famine of the late 1990s, in which perhaps a million people out of the 23 million population of North Korea died of hunger-related causes. The 1990s was a period of readjustment in its relationship. Many people thought that North Korea would not survive, that North Korea would collapse. Russia completely turned its back on North Korea, demanded that North Korea repay its debts in hard currency, which it could not do. And the new post-communist government of Russia seemed to think that, as many in the West did, North Korea would soon collapse anyway. China was a bit more subtle in the way it dealt with North Korea, although it also made economic demands on the North. And over time really became North Korea's only ally, although how close that alliance is also somewhat perhaps questionable. China began to fill the gap in the 1990s of North Korea's economic needs, and in the current time gives perhaps 30 or 40% of North Korea's food and energy assistance. And in the nuclear confrontation between North Korea and the United States that emerged in 1993 and 1994, and continues more or less to this day, China played a very important intermediary role, including hosting meetings between North Korean and Chinese diplomats here in Beijing. And China has also supported North Korea's leadership transition from Kim Il-sung to his son Kim Jong-il in the mid-1990s, and seems to be doing so as North Korea is making a transition to the third generation of the Kim family today. There was a change in South Korea, I don't want to go into detail here, for about 10 years in which there was a serious move toward engagement between the North and South. China in many ways benefited from that, but also was in a unique position, having good relations with both Seoul and Pyongyang, and a de facto two Koreas policy. China continued to play a central role in diffusing U.S.-North Korea crises and hosting what became the six-party talks from 2003 among North and South Korea, China, Russia, and Japan. In the last 2 years, as North and South Korean relations have deteriorated, China has continued to play an important, albeit sometimes very delicate, role between the two. Now, as I said, China has supported the generational transition of the 1980s and 1990s from Kim Jong-il, who began from a very early stage in the 1970s to visit China with his father, Kim Il-sung. Kim Il-sung died in July of 1994. You see the two of them in the central picture on top of Mount Baekdu on the border with China. And North Korea appears to be in the process of making a third generation transition between Kim Jong-il on the bottom left-hand picture and his son, Kim Il-sung's grandson, Kim Jong-un. The picture on the left is one that I took in June of this year, showing Kim Jong-il's visit to China, the route of his visit to China, which was very much celebrated. I said I would talk a little bit about my impressions of my visit to North Korea. It's not that often that Americans get to travel, so I wanted to say a bit of how I interpreted what's been going on in North Korea. First of all, the leadership succession. I know many of you do not read Korean, but we have the English translation as well as a poem that appeared earlier this year. But notice the phrase, the fortune of having the great leader, the general, and the four-star general. People ask, is North Korea really serious about this new generational transition? I did not see many pictures of Kim Jong-un, but we did see this. This was in many places throughout Pyongyang and the countryside, always together, these three slogans: the great leader, the general, and the four-star general, meaning Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il in Kim Jong-un. So this was the only evidence that I saw that indicated that North Korea was very seriously working toward a third-generation transition of leadership publicly. That is, to make the public being aware of this, and of course everyone would understand what this slogan meant in North Korea. North Korea remains a very militant, a very anti-imperialist country. So you can't read that English translation on the bottom very well. It says, "Let us thoroughly prepare to repel the invaders at once." And in particular, North Korea remains very insistent internally in its own propaganda in its opposition to the United States. So here is another poster I saw, a thousandfold revenge on the American imperialist bastards. I guess is that maybe too strong? No, perhaps not. And where I saw this was actually very interesting. This was actually in a kind of secret floor of an international hotel, only for the hotel staff to visit. So this seems to me to indicate that despite this exposure to foreigners, and Americans in particular, there's a concern on the part of the government that this kind of ideology remained very strong in the minds of the people. This particular poster is in reference to the atrocities committed by the U.S. during the Korean War, and specifically a massacre that is said to have occurred in Sincheon, which with Korean members of the audience I think will have heard. But at the same time, North Korea has announced that it will be a strong and prosperous nation in 2012, which is only less than 2 months away. So we will see how that happens. But 2012 is important because it is the 100th anniversary of the birth of founding leader Kim Il-sung. So this is the announcement that North Korea will be a strong and prosperous country by then. And again, these slogans are everywhere. There are also familiar patterns that we are seeing emerge once again. And in particular, I think it's very significant that shortly after his visits to China, Kim Jong-il also visited Russia and met with Russian leader Medvedev, discussing economic assistance, gas pipeline to North Korea, and other issues, which seems to me to reflect this kind of playing off the sides, or at least trying to get what it could from both Russia and China, a pattern that was followed throughout much of its history. And in conclusion, what is the relationship between China and North Korea today? This is a photograph of the friendship bridge across the Tumen River. I would call this an ambivalent friendship. I wouldn't downplay the degree to which there is a genuine sense of commonality and comradeship between North and South Korea, at least North Korea and China, at least in some sectors. The relationship between North Korea and China is a complicated one in which there are different actors in different levels. There are the governments, the parties, and individuals who have relationships between the two countries. But fundamentally, I think there is still a mutual strategic utility, particularly with regards to the United States. And in that sense, the relationship of lips and teeth is still valid in the relationship between North and South Korea today. For North Korea, China is its economic lifeline and window to the world. North Korea is still very isolated, and it depends a great deal on China for educating its citizens abroad, for technology transfer, and for bringing money to North Korea through tourism and through business and so forth. At the same time, North Korea has always been concerned about depending too much on a foreign country, and that is expressed today in a concern about overdependence on China. The relationship is one ultimately of public support, but private ambivalence on both sides. Thank you. I want to leave questions, time for questions and answers.
Additional
is an international or domestic corporate program too busy. The management is not good.
Well, thank you very much for the time. Well, I didn't expect that I would be assigned to discuss about Charles' presentation tonight. I don't have any question about the history part. It's quite very long. I have maybe a few questions. In the last part of your question, North Korea is very much concerned about what you call the over-dependence on China. Well, I would like to ask you if you identify any evidences or any episode which might imply they are very much worrying about ever more depending situation of North Korea on China. One of the speculation today is, particularly in the economic sense, North Korea is becoming a kind of colonizing, being colonized country by ever more economic dependency on China. So objectively speaking, yes, they should be concerned about that. And in terms of the long history of Chucha ideology, it's very natural for them. But in empirical reality, if they are very much concerned about this tendency, what sort of way out from this may be possible. We would be very much happy if we can hear more about the concrete reality of what you described as over dependency on the one hand, and on the other hand, how did you see any tendency, episode, something like that, which indicate your concern about this. Now, of course, Charles is not a specialist in international relationship, but he's a historian, so there may be many interesting questions about history, but about this history, actually we have one expert here, Kim Dong-gil, Professor Kim Dong-gil, who is teaching history at Beijing University, so he might have many questions here. For me, I'm a sociologist. I'm always concerned, I'm always curious where the kind of political legitimacy in North Korea comes from. While, of course, you mentioned increasing threat from outside, imperialism. That is pretty much a negative side. What about the internal kind of more constructive sources which support kind of legitimacy to North Korean regime? If you see any kind of speculation out there for that. And also, in the relationship between North Korea and China today, you said it is very much ambivalent friendship. I agree with that. Yeah. It's very much ambivalent. But nonetheless, ambivalent in the sense that quite large number of Chinese intellectuals, for example, including journalists, they are pretty much skeptical about North Korean reality. Why should China really support North Korea that much as we have found so far? But from the side of the government, party state of China, the degree of support seems to be extraordinary this day. extraordinary. The way in which they treat Kim Jong-il, for instance, it's very much extraordinary. So ambivalent in the sense of emerging skeptical mood within a kind of civil society in China. But what about very important, the role of the ruling party or the state? Seems to me China has been and still is and pretty much will be governed by very strong kind of leadership hegemony exercised by the party state. But that kind of question I can. Thank you so much.
Let me say some words. Firstly, they're open to the floor, and you can raise your hand, identify yourself, to express your questions and comments briefly. Thank you very much, Professor Armstrong, and I really have enjoyed your presentation on the evolution of Chinese or North Korea relations with China, with our country, and it seems to me now I have many words to say and to comment, but just because you have already inspired me, and but I just say one fact. One fact is today South Korea is South Korea's largest trading partner, trade, investment, and others economically is China. And also, in this world, and in this world, last year, India's largest trading partner is China. Brazil's largest trading partner is also China. And President Obama, U.S. President Obama visited Brazil in last March. I was in Sao Paulo, and I witnessed the President Obama's visit to the largest economy in South America. And also, the almost every economy in Asia and in the globe, the BRICS cooperation mechanism, including South Africa. 2 years ago, South Africa's largest trading partner is also China. Became China. So, and I think this inevitably and naturally, and the North Korea is still in the early stage of opening up, if it copies the Chinese model. So even in the relatively mature stage of North Korea's reform, economic transformation, and opening up, I believe China will be DPRK's largest trading, economic, financial partner in the future. So, and the people talk about the over dependence and maybe I understand and some in the South very much worry about the increasingly economic ties between China and North Korea, and but if people in the United States now, in Europe now, talking about the post-West times and all post-transatlantic era, and China maybe economically just inside of economy, and China will surpass, replace the United States as the largest economy in the globe, in the global economic system. And if so, you can say, such economies continue, over depend on China. But now China is South Korea's production base. China serve the global, assembly, factory, so-called 世界工厂. And South Korea and Japan and others, and the United States, Europe, and China, and the people in China now talking about the Chinese economy is hijacked and colonialized by multinational companies, particularly the Korean companies and Japanese companies. This is my first reaction, response. The second, let me just, because this is Professor Armstrong is a global, well-recognized history authority, a Northeast Asia history authority, and I'm not a historian. I'm a professor of international relations. But I would say, some very important history lesson, and the lesson for China. China in the past 100 years, and just both sides in Beijing and in Taipei, Taipei, just marked the 100 years anniversary, the centennial anniversary of China's first revolution, the contemporary modern revolution, 辛亥革命, and the 辛亥革命, before the 辛亥革命, the Xinhai revolution, and after the Xinhai revolution, and the Chinese nation, the Chinese people suffered two unfortunates. One is Russia, the imperialist Russia's invasion and occupation, and the other is the Japanese, invasion and occupation. And so, the Professor Armstrong mentioned the cooperation and the common right, common interest between Chinese people, Chinese government, including the Kuomintang nationalist government before 1949. And the Korea, our case, exile government also was in Chongqing and in Shanghai, And so, and we need to learn lessons from history. And the history will tell the our Chinese people and the world, the world people, and the next, next 100 years, next century, this century, and to avoid, and the total war, military conflict, violent conflict between more peoples in the world, and. I think we need new paradigms, new seeking frameworks to organize international relations. And so I believe the people now talking about the power shift, and China will be the next dominant power, global dominant power, and. If so, and according to such thinking, and maybe China may retake the Korean Peninsula to protect, to colonize, and I don't think such thinking possible, and in the future, and it is not the Chinese current foreign policy, of course, and also I believe the next new generations, Chinese generations, where the new generations make their foreign policies. I believe and China will continue to explore peaceful. The coexistence and peaceful development with our neighbors. This is my second response, and I don't want to occupy a lot of times, and because our major speaker is Professor Armstrong, and the floor now open, and questions directly to Professor Armstrong, please.
Thank you, Professor Pong, and thank you, Professor Charles. I have one short comment and a short question for Charles. One short comment is for Professor Pong.